We're into the semi-finals of the Freestyle Chess GOAT Challenge, and I'm looking at the game, the first classical game between Magnus Carlsen and Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Now, some of these Fischer random games resolve themselves after the opening into fairly standard middle game positions. I mean, known to us. But there are others, like this one, that start out very oddly. The middle game is really weird. And then even at the end, in this game, we have some very unusual checkmating patterns. So watch out for those. There's some good stuff here, actually. But I have to say, I found this game a real challenge to analyse. So that said, let's plunge in. So let's take a look at the baseline. Yeah, it's pretty messed up. Got the king and queen sort of the wrong way round. We got the rook in the corner, but yeah, these pieces pretty oddly placed. In the other games today, we saw e4, we saw d4. But Carlsen goes his own way and plays g4. So, I've talked in previous days about freeing your bishops and freeing your queen. Well, that does nothing for for these pieces. It also doesn't really claim any space in the center. So what's Magnus about? So e5. Well, that looks like a more normal move to me from Abdusattorov, claiming space in the center and also supported by the queen. Knight g3. Okay, so now we begin to see a little bit of what Magnus is about. The knight comes here behind the pawn and he gets some control over these squares. But he's still got to think how he's bringing the bishops and the queen into the game. f6. Okay, a standard Fischer random move. This bishop is freed. And now Carlsen played d4. And he described this after the game as a bit over-enthusiastic. Yeah, well, he sacrifices a pawn. He certainly doesn't need to do that, but, well, perhaps he felt that it was time to sort of strike back in the middle of the board. So, what was Magnus intending after pawn takes pawn? I should say, Abdusattorov did not do this. Well, his idea was actually to play like this, f4, releasing the bishop. I mean, this is very strange. And after c5 to play c3, so a new kind of gambit. And after d6, he felt that he would have excellent compensation for the pawn after knight b3 and then castles queenside, and the rook is already bearing down on the king here, and in fact white's pieces would be superb in that case. But in this position, black does not need to play d6, but instead plays b6. And actually this is now tricky for white. It's a very different situation. That pawn is ready to come to d5 in one go. It's probably not enough for white. So after this move, I know I'm going into some detail here. Basically, Magnus would just have to try to recover that pawn in a different way, knight b3. But it's not altogether ideal. Anyway, Abdusattorov decided instead just to bring a piece out, knight b6. Knight d3. Now in this case, e takes and then f3 and the bishop can take the pawn. Strange position. But anyway, Abdusattorov instead plays d6. And after f3, then he took on d4. Because he'd spotted a little idea. This is why he played d6. He wanted to advance his c-pawn. Bishop comes back. And c4. This is risky. but it does sort of mess up White's pieces a little bit. Carlsen made a typical Carlsen move here, actually, in some ways. He decides to give up this bishop for the knight, and the reason he does that is to claim some squares. So positionally, well, it's actually still really double-edged, but this knight feels quite happy here. On b4, you can see black's pawns are a bit of a mess. You know, that would have appealed to Carlsen greatly. Black does have the two bishops, however. This bishop still looks pretty bad. d5 played, so that frees the dark square bishop. c3. So Carlsen is claiming squares. This is what he likes to do. You know, can you imagine, you know, a knight sitting on d4? I mean, this knight on b4 is already very interesting, actually. But black does have those two bishops. Bishop f4. Carlsen goes for knight h5. And the bishop came back. And f4. So it's still a really weird position. So that shuts this one out for the moment. Castle's queenside. Knight g3. Knight hops back. So this bishop is shut out of the game for the moment. And Abdusattorov plays g6. Maybe this was the moment to play d4. I mean, obviously, if this is taken, then the king is going to be in some trouble. So check. And then castle's queenside. Another very strange position. That's what white should do. Anyway, that's another story. g6 played. e3. I'm sure that Carlsen was very glad to get this kind of pawn structure. So he's got control over the d4 square. Queen d7. Attacking this pawn. Queen e2. And rook e8. So that's Abdusattorov's style, actually. You know, he's a very responsible player. So instead of making a break with d4, which is a bit weird, he's made sure that he has good coordination. There's a little bit of pressure here. And then he's ready to sort out his minor pieces somehow. Carlsen played knight c2. So absolutely typical. Looking perhaps to station the knight on d4. I mean, he could have played it in a very different way. For example, a4 with the potential to play a5. But knight c2 played. Bishop f8. So the bishop is doing nothing here, so Abdusattorov just brings it back. And b4. Oh, that's Magnus's idea. So he's making sure that this bishop just isn't coming into the game. And if that's taken en passant, well, that should be good for white with the rook on an open file. So, yeah, basically Carlsen playing in a very positional way, taking away that square from the bishop. Bishop e6, threatening this pawn, so h3. Carlsen could have played f5, but perhaps he felt he wasn't ready to break open the position when, you know, these pieces look a little bit strange. But anyway, he played h3. h5, trying to break things up a bit. Knight d4. Exchange, well, not an exchange, but h6, g4, and now f5. So if pawn takes f5, then this wins material. So the bishop came back, and h6, g4. So material is still even. But Carlsen's managed to get this pawn to f5, and that rather restricts black's pieces. Queen c7. Hits the knight. Queen f3. Whoops, bounced ahead. Queen f3. Defends, and bishop h6. So this bishop actually gets into the game. Nevertheless, it was still worth playing f5 because these pieces are really restricted. Rook e1. But such a strange position for both sides. You know, Carlsen hasn't bothered doing anything with his king yet. Bishop g5. Okay, it seems solid. a4. Well, this could be dangerous. G takes f5. Bishop takes f5, check. It was possible to take with a knight as well, but anyway, check. And rook e2 played. So very steady from Carlsen. I'm not sure why he didn't want to push on with a5. I mean, it feels very natural to me to open up the a file. You know, he had this option quite a few moves ago of playing with a4, a5, but he seems really reluctant to go for it. But rook e2, so he's still playing very steadily actually. Knight g6, this knight comes into the game. Now that does look like potentially a menacing piece. So Carlsen hacks the knight off and then comes in with the knight. So we've got a strange position with two bishops against two knights. And Carlsen goes for it with a5. So he is getting there, and this rook has the potential to swing to the a file. Queen e4. Carlsen exchanges and just takes on b6. So he's exchanged a couple of pawns, and now he threatens mate. And black really has to exchange off here. So there's no checkmate on a8. Now, just out of interest, I'm going to stop here. How would you assess this position? Don't just go on the players. Abdusattorov is very strong in his own right, but you know, serious question. Do you think white's better? Do you think black's better? Is it about even? I mean, I was shocked to see that this game actually ended in just a couple more moves. So we're on move 34, and after Carlsen's 36th move, Abdusattorov resigned. It's extraordinary. So let me take you through what happened in the game, and I'll go back and we'll look at a couple of alternatives. So it went rook e8. Rook h1 is a really powerful move. You wouldn't at first glance appreciate why, but it's a really strong move, putting the rook on the open file. Rook f8, and after knight d6, Abdusattorov resigned. And I was looking at the position and going, hang on, just a moment. What's going on here? Well, it is really bad for black. It is resignable. I don't think I'd have resigned. I'd have wanted to test my opponent a little bit. But black is completely lost here. So here's why. Okay, rook d8 can simply be met by knight e6. Now, that can't be taken because there's a back rank trick. So rook g8, knight c5. So the threat is, well, we're going to see this threat any moment. You can see the king is completely boxed in. These bishops can't help. If rook d8 makes no difference, knight d7 check. Again, if that's taken, then rook here. And rook a1 is a beautiful checkmate, supported by the pawn and the knight. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Okay, let's try something else. All right, what about a random check? Does it help? f5. Then knight e6 again, forking rook and bishop, and knight takes g5. Just wins a piece for nothing because rook takes again. There's a back rank checkmate. And if, let me see, f5, again knight e6. What else is there? I mean, basically, this is the threat. Knight e6, knight c7, and this time rook a8 mate supported by the knight. There is absolutely no defense in this position. It's quite extraordinary. It's hard to sort of imagine at first glance. Let's just go back a couple of moves. So, you know, we've arrived at this endgame. Okay, let's try rook h8. That's the obvious move to claim the h-file before white does. Well, then rook a5, attacking here. So the rook switches back. Knight e6 again, attacking the rook. And then knight c7, threatening mate. I mean, okay, you can give up the rook, but that's obviously losing. It is quite extraordinary that black is really struggling here. The best chance is to take on f5. Let's get rid of one of those knights and then bring the bishop back to try to defend here. But even so, this is extremely unpleasant. The rook sweeps in, just threatening to take this one, and then that'll be weak. And the king is still in massive trouble. So if bishop takes c3, then knight d6, well, you can see white is just breaking through here and actually will also set up mating nets again. So it's quite extraordinary. Very unusual position, and well, at a certain point, you know, round about here, Carlsen judged that in fact he had a fantastic position, but that was not easy to foresee. If you haven't checked out my other video featuring Magnus Carlsen's game from last night against Firuz Jah, beautiful endgame of bishop and 2 against knight and 1. It's really worth taking a look at, so do check out that video. So this means that Abdusattorov needs to win the second classical game to stay in the match. Thanks for watching.